Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
This event was recorded on the 18th of February 2013, when Miles Larmer discussed Africa's new populist politics.
Thank you very much for coming and for the invitation. I want to try and convince you that something new is happening in Africa. A new populist politics is giving expression to African societies. African peoples are, for the first time in a number of decades, finding a political voice. Not necessarily a political voice that all Western politicians want to hear. And I'm going to try and explain tonight what this voice sounds like, why it's happening now, and what it might mean for Africa's future. I'm going to talk in particular about the country I know best, Zambia, a country whose populist politics found shape last year with the election of Michael Sata as president. And Sata came to power in Zambia as a result of his attacks, particularly on foreign investors, most notably those from China, who he claimed were working against the country, and against a recent backdrop of unpopular economic liberalisation and privatisation policies. To really make sense of this, it requires a bit of history, and I'm a historian, but I'm going to try and keep this embarrassingly brief and embarrassingly crude, if you like. What I want to say very briefly is that African countries' attempts to establish their own control over their economies, to turn political independence achieved in the 1950s and 1960s into economic independence, really ran into the ground in the 1970s when commodity prices fell through the floor, when the oil crisis hit, and the inability of African countries to go beyond being providers of raw materials, whether cocoa, copper, uranium and so on, really hit home. African countries in that period acquired a vast and, in retrospect, unpayable debt burden. And that debt burden was used by Western countries and Western banks to hold African states to very crude, almost uniform programs of economic liberalisation. The message from the late 1970s really to the late 1990s was broadly the same. Privatise, cut state spending, allow the market to flourish. And that was the case under relatively undemocratic governments in the 1970s and 1980s. And despite a massive wave of democratic change in the continent in the early 1990s, inspired in part by events in Eastern Europe at the same time, similar policies continue to be implemented by democratic governments precisely because they couldn't get out from under this burden of debt, conditionality. They were, in the words of one political scientist, choiceless democracies. You can have as many political parties as you want as long as they all sign up to our programme. Economic liberalisation did not, in my view, work. I can try and explain why if people have questions about that, but very broadly, I would argue that African countries were simply too poor to make market economics flourish on the continent. Privatisation, a key part of liberalisation in most economies, made things worse. State-owned industries were certainly corrupt during the one-party systems of the 1960s and 70s, but privatisation proved to be a fantastic mechanism of putting wealth into the hands of a handful of politicians and their cronies. And this was really powerfully pressed on these countries by Western donors. In the early 2000s then, in Zambia and elsewhere on the continent, there was a real pessimism about growth and in some respects about the prospect of holding African governments to account. Certain things began to change in the mid-2000s. There was a period of quite sudden, almost entirely unpredicted economic growth during that time. Of course, the IMF and World Bank believed that it was their medicine, finally, after decades, beginning to work on these notoriously problematic patients in Africa. But I think the real effect was simply that commodity prices, low since the mid-1970s, were growing again, particularly mineral prices, and particularly because of increasing demand from China. China's industrial demand led to rising mineral prices, and this led to growth in those countries in particular which had minerals. Zambia, for example, experienced 5% annual growth from 2005 to 2008. And in that country, an industry which had been moribund suddenly burst into life. The copper price quadrupled, exploratory mines began to be developed, and the resultant effects of that are interesting because economic growth should, of course, make people happy, lead to a higher living standards, all that sort of thing. In fact, economic growth led to rising discontent, anger at the fact that these newly privatised companies, sold off only a few years ago as loss-making companies, were now making enormous amounts of money, but almost none of that money was finding its way into the exchequer of the state, let alone into the pockets of workers or communities. And that's partly because under then secret development agreements signed under the IMF auspices, but by the Zambian state and these companies, 0.6% of mining royalties were paid to the Zambian state. 0.6% of profits were paid as royalties. So virtually none of the money made by these companies was paid to the Zambian state itself. That led in the mid-2000s, in a context of growth, to rising social unrest and rising labour unrest. At the same time, Zambia received substantial debt relief as a result of what was known as the PRSP programme. Essentially, having implemented economic liberalisation, it got its reward. Debt fell from $6.7 billion to about $500 million. Now, some of you may have participated in activities around the Jubilee 2000 campaign, a major campaign in this country involving NGOs and churches that led to the Gleneagles G8 summit in 2005. And you might have wondered whether anything ever came of that. Now, I want to argue strongly that debt relief made a real difference. It enabled a number of African states to throw off the conditionalities imposed upon them at precisely the time when a level of economic growth enabled these states to begin to make their own policy decisions, begin to think again about an alternative model of development to neoliberal economics. So this was the context in which a new politics emerged in various countries, including in Zambia. And to some extent, this was stronger in countries initially with significant mineral assets. In Zambia, the Patriotic Front Party was formed in 2001. It got a derisory 2% of the vote in that year's presidential elections. But 5 years later, it got 29%. And that was specifically because of its leaders' attacks on the privatisation policies and liberalisation policies implemented by the then incumbent governments. The 2006 manifesto of this party said this: the main beneficiaries of the current regime, apart from relatives and friends of the government ministers, are mostly foreigners. Leaders seem to have no conscience. They have not been moved by the plight and suffering of Zambian workers, who have been reduced to daily casual employees in their own land, while foreign firms and consultants feast on their sweat. During the election campaign, the leader, Michael Satta's attacks on Chinese and Indian investors were criticised as bordering on racism, and they certainly did have an element of racial abuse about them. This was a campaign focused on condemning foreign ownership of the economy, appearing to attack foreign investors as individuals. Chinese investment has, of course, been a major issue in Africa recently. Some Africans genuinely believe that Chinese investment provides a strong model of growth, an alternative model of development for the continent. Others, however, focus on China's appalling record on human rights and on labour standards, and that certainly has found expression in Africa itself. In 2005, around 50 workers were killed in an explosion in an explosives plant. And what really struck people was that these workers were being paid between $15 and $30 a month to do really difficult jobs handling something as dangerous as explosives. More recently, in 2010, when workers at the Colum coal mine in southern Zambia went on strike, Chinese managers responded by opening fire on them with live rounds, injuring a number in the process. And those tensions have continued to the present day. Last year at Colum, miners killed a Chinese manager during an industrial dispute. So Satta's party gave voice to these kind of discontents and concerns. The leader Satta proposed that 49% of any privatised company would be brought into Zambian hands. And that led to real diplomatic tensions with China at the time and tensions on the ground. When the Chinese president Hu Jintao visited in 2007, he was unable to visit, as planned, the Chambishi investment zone, a kind of gold mine of Chinese investment in Africa, because of the fear of widespread popular unrest. I can talk more about that if people have questions, but I think the one thing I would certainly say is the idea held by many Africans that Chinese politicians don't interfere in African domestic politics is extremely wide of the mark, and I can talk about that if people are interested. On the other hand, many Africans do believe that China provides an alternative. It gives African states somewhere else to play off Western companies against. You've got at least two different powers interested, and that gives you some room for manoeuvre. PF, this party I'm talking about, increased its share in subsequent elections, and Michael Sata was elected as president, I think I said last year actually, at the end of 2011. By that time he had toned down the most vicious attacks on foreign investors. He said only that he sought investors that had the nation's interest at heart. And by 2011, Sata was being identified as one of Africa's new populist leaders. Amongst their wider number, a figure that some people may have heard of, the youth leader of the African National Congress in South Africa, no longer the youth leader, a young man called Julius Malema, who called for the radical redistribution of land owned by white farmers in South Africa, and also for nationalisation of the mining industry. Malema in turn looked to some extent to Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe as a figure who could inspire this kind of movement. That kind of association with Mugabe, and maybe the reactions of some of you to that, leads us to question the classic problem in assessing any of this is separating out the hysteria which such movements prompt, particularly amongst policymakers in certain situations, with the reality on the ground. I speak sometimes to people from DFID and the Foreign Office, and it seems clear to me that they're really, really worried about a new generation of radical populist leaders in Africa. But at the same time, they're not the only ones. Many church people, NGO leaders, some political activists in African countries are worried about charismatic leaders making promises that can't be kept, and share Western governments' desire for a more, shall we say, disciplined, orthodox policy-making environment. A number of African states have, after 2 decades of, as I've suggested, relatively impotent policy debates, begun to assert their sovereignty in ways in relation to international capital and donors. Just a couple of quick examples. Angola, which has the benefit of enormous oil revenue, has been able to resist IMF demands for greater transparency in government spending. In 2012, the Tanzanian government rejected IMF calls for reforms to the tax system on international mining companies because the government believed it would make it more difficult to collect tax from those companies. The deputy minister responsible said, "We have to learn more during this period when the giant mining companies benefit more from Africa's mineral wealth than the citizens." In 2011, the Malawian government likewise intervened to rejected calls for the IMF to devalue the currency. Now, the point isn't that all these policies by populist governments are progressive or correct. It's more the argument that African governments are able to put forward policies, to put forward alternative policy arguments, and to be judged on them by their electorates. Another recent shift is the welcome, I think, development of more critical media, newspapers, more independent newspapers, but also, very importantly, local radio stations broadcasting in indigenous languages. Civil society organisations as well, some of which are both critical of international interference in policy making, but at the same time critical of government policies. I think one of the most significant recent events in this regard is the shooting of platinum miners in Marikana in South Africa last year, an event that made headlines around the world and particularly on the continent because it appeared to exemplify the distance between even the most apparently progressive governments, an African National Congress government allied with the trade union movement, but which was perceived by ordinary miners as on the side of capital, on the side of a business which had no interest in their living standards and was actually complicit in the cover-up of the police shooting of miners. What's the influence here? The easiest international parallel is with leaders characterized sometimes as populist or left-wing radical in Latin America. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, in some respects Cristina Kirchner in Argentina. Leaders who over the last decade have articulated a critique of free market capitalism, American domination of policy space on a global level, the need for a more socially oriented alternative to free market capitalism. What these leaders say varies considerably in their policies and ideological positions, but I think they have provided some inspiration to their new African counterparts. I use this depiction of populist, and I want to just try and explain briefly what I mean by that. Firstly, we're talking primarily about charismatic individuals rather than heads of political parties with well-developed structures and ideologically informed programs. Men like Satter use vivid imagery and powerful rhetoric, often alienating the political classes but playing well with the woman or the man in the streets. This means, however, their parties lack the capacity to hold them to account when, for example, they suddenly change their positions or policies. Their lack of ideological positioning means they often rely on morality, Christian morality often, to inform their rhetoric, their siding with the common man and so on. And that can also mean that on the ground, the message they put over can change from place to place and time to time. We've found that Michael Satter, for example, will employ some ethnic elements in his rhetoric when talking to villages, in particular rural parts of Zambia, that he wouldn't use when talking to a big urban rally in the copper mining towns or in the capital, Lusaka. The danger, of course, with such strategies is they might provide some articulation, reflection of the anger and grievances of the poor and working classes, but do little or nothing to actually change their material circumstances. We now have Satter's brief record in office, 18 months or so since he was elected, and we can begin to make some judgments in regard to that. What changes has he made? Well, for example, last year Zambia renationalised its railway network overnight with no compensation to the companies involved. Something which, travelling up here on the train, occurred to me, we might be not unpopular with many of us. The policy certainly dismayed some observers. The reality is, however, that the railway industry has, since privatisation in the early 1990s, been extremely moribund, and nationalising it overnight doesn't mean that the government then has money to make it work properly. It's a classic sort of populist gesture, which doesn't necessarily mean much will change on the ground. Mine taxes, this crucial issue in an economy which remains dominated by copper mining and cobalt mining, have not risen since Satter came to power. He certainly applied a sort of visible pressure on the mining companies, and they have responded with greater promises in regard to corporate social responsibility, as we might see it, improved labour standards, environmental promises, we might say. But there are structural problems here. The reality is the state, after decades of decline and hollowing out by liberalisation, remains very weak in its ability to hold companies to account for their policies. And at the same time, and here perhaps we see the difference with somewhere like Venezuela, very disconnected from society, and it's therefore its ability to mobilise people to perhaps keep its supporters on the streets after the election in order to assist them in putting pressure on companies and capital. What Satter has been good at is mobilising history in some respects. He would see himself, he wouldn't use the term populist, he would maybe see himself as a patriotic nationalist. And one of the first things he did was rename the country's main airport after Kenneth Kaunda, the country's first president, in a classic piece of sort of historical mobilisation. Kaunda, quite old now, but very much a respected elder statesman, turns up at most of his rallies to offer his kind of historical support. I think this plays to something which is important to me, which is that in some respects, there are very good reasons why the first generation of nationalist politicians, like Kaunda, were unable to turn political independence into economic independence. And Satter, by positioning himself close to that generation of nationalists, is perhaps in some ways in danger of replicating those limitations on that first generation of African government. That's perhaps a slightly down note point, so I want to finish on a couple of more positive things. I want to argue that the rise of populism in Africa is a positive sign that many countries now have increasingly effective democracies and growing economies, and there is, as a result, an increasing choice between parties offering distinct policy positions. This is the result of, I think, three things. Better functioning economies at best, or at worst, at least, increasing revenue, often the result of mineral exports or better exports of various kinds. That enables an increased degree of internal tax revenue, governments able to make their own policies, not dependent so much on donors. Secondly, debt relief, substantially reducing the hold of donors and Western states over African governments. And thirdly, the campaigns and actions of Africans themselves, both to bring about democracy, as many did in the early 1990s, and then to try and deepen that democratic structure by holding their governments to account for the policies they introduce. I'm talking today primarily about sub-Saharan Africa, but you can see a similar dynamic in North African countries affected by the Arab Spring. It's a boring historian's thing to say, but one moment doesn't lead to profound change. What we saw in sub-Saharan Africa is, in the early 1990s, campaigns to bring about multi-party democracy, and then a decade of realization that simply that wasn't going to be enough. It would take 10 or 15 or 20 years for civil society and social movements to embed more democratic accountability, to hold governments to account. And I think that's, in some respects, what we may see further north, a democratic breakthrough, an authoritarian backlash, a degree of disillusionment, but then also enabling a deeper analysis, a rethinking of what it takes, what kinds of popular political forms are needed to hold politicians to account. Some of what I've said, as I've suggested, doesn't show a kind of politics perhaps in line with what progressive thinkers in the West might always want to see. The reality is, if we in Western countries want Africans to be free, to control their own societies and economies, we need to deal with the fact that when they take political decisions, we might not always like them. They might not always go in the direction we like. For the last couple of centuries at least, Africa has been a place of intervention, of Westerners shaping the continent, of imposing their ideas of what they think is best for the continent and its peoples. And some of those were brutal exploiters, but at least as many were people who believed they were doing good work on the continent. I think you can draw a line from David Livingstone to Tony Blair in this respect. Interveners, people who believed in enlightenment and educating Africans in perhaps the best way, or the right way of running a society. So if Africans are going to be truly free, they'll be free to disagree with what we think is best for them. And that will be the clearest sign that a new kind of politics has arrived. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to hearing your comments and questions. Thank you.
Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and the British Science Association. We're also supported by Ginger's Cafe in Dance City, who host the events.